Hello, my name is Bruce Andrews. Welcome to a reading of Evangeline, a tale of Arcady by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. This particular reading is taken from the 1899 printing by Alex Grosset and Company, the Minnehaha edition, New York. Specifically, this book belonged to my grandmother. I hope you will enjoy listening to it as much as I enjoy reading it to you. I hope you will bear with me for a few moments as I take us back to the start of this awesome journey that Longfellow has created for us to experience through the eyes of the beautiful Evangeline. History documents the terrible tragedy of Le Grand Dérangement, but history lacks color and passion and personality. Longfellow's fertile imagination has provided us with that color and passion and personality as we follow in Evangeline's footsteps as she searches for her soulmate, Gabriel. Her journey begins on the shores of Nova Scotia in 1755 as she sees her village and all she has ever known go up in smoke, and her father lies dead at her feet. She and all her friends and neighbors are loaded onto contract ships and dispatched to unknown lands down the eastern seaboard of the colonies. She is separated from her betrothed from this point forward, and thus begins her search as she travels by foot over unfamiliar and hostile territory, ever hopeful of reuniting with him. Her travels take her inland through forests and fields, ever hopeful and optimistic that Gabriel is just over the next hill. In this current episode, episode 4, we will hear Longfellow's words in Chapter 2 and Chapter 3 of Part the Second continue to describe the scenery through which Evangeline travels in her quest to find Gabriel. As she reaches the banks of the mighty Mississippi River and proceeds down it by boat, she finds hope in the presence of some of her friends from the village of Grand Pré. She reaches Louisiana and finds the air sweet and filled with the perfume of flowers. Father Felician prays with her and blesses her in her ongoing search. One of the warmest reunions occurs when Evangeline finds Basil, the blacksmith, Gabriel's father. He's become very successful as a farmer and herdsman and welcomes Evangeline with his whole heart. Even Michael the fiddler has reason to celebrate at the joyous reunion. The party atmosphere is tempered somewhat by the fact that Gabriel has left his father's side only the day before. But Evangeline decides to rest that day and evening and resume her search on the morrow. Oh, so close. Yet surely there must be a wonderful reunion just around the next bend in the river, as Evangeline dreams of it and prepares to set forth with renewed enthusiasm and the support of the community surrounding Basil. As you listen to Longfellow's words, try to imagine the beautiful countryside as described in the book. An interesting sidelight to these descriptions of the Mississippi River Valley and the surrounding geography, Longfellow himself never visited the area in person. All the descriptions are a product of his fertile imagination, another gift of the finest poetic license, don't you agree? It was the month of May. Far down the beautiful river, past the Ohio shore and past the mouth of the Wabash, into the golden stream of the broad and swift Mississippi, floated a cumbrous boat that was rowed by Acadian boatmen. It was a band of exiles, a raft, as it were, from the shipwrecked nation, scattered along the coast, now floating together, bound by the bonds of a common belief and a common misfortune. Men and women and children who, guided by hope or by hearsay, sought for their kith and their kin among the few-acred farmers on the Acadian coast and the prairies of fair Opelousas. With them Evangeline went, and her guide the Father Felician. Onward o'er sunken sands, through a wilderness somber with forests, day after day they glided adown the turbulent river. Night after night, by their blazing fires, encamped on its borders. Now through rushing chutes among green islands where plume-like cotton trees nodded their shadowy crests, they swept with the current, then emerged into broad lagoons where silvery sandbars lay in the stream, and along the wimpling waves of their margin Shining with snow-white plumes, large flocks of pelicans waded. Level the landscape grew, and along the shores of the river, shaded by china trees in the midst of luxuriant gardens, stood the houses of planters with Negro cabins and dovecots. They were approaching the region where reigns perpetual summer, where through the golden coast and groves of orange and citron sweeps with majestic curve the river away to the eastward. They, too, swerved from their course, and entering the bayou of the Plaquemine, soon were lost in a maze of sluggish and devious waters, which, like a network of steel, extended in every direction. Over their heads the towering and tenebrous boughs of the cypress met in a dusky arch, and trailing mosses in midair waved like banners that hang on the walls of ancient cathedrals. Death-like the silence seemed, and unbroken, save by the herons home to their roosts in the cedar trees returning at sunset, or by the owl as he greeted the moon with demoniac laughter. Lovely the moonlight was as it glanced and gleamed on the water, gleamed on the columns of cypress and cedar sustaining the arches, down through whose broken vaults it fell as through chinks in a ruin. Dreamlike and indistinct and strange were all things around them, and o'er their spirits there came a feeling of wonder and sadness, strange forebodings of ill, unseen and that cannot be compassed. As at the tramp of a horse's hoof on the turf of the prairies, far in advance are closed the leaves of the shrinking mimosa, so, at the hoofbeats of fate, with sad forebodings of evil, shrinks and closes the heart ere the stroke of doom has attained it. But Evangeline's heart was sustained by a vision that faintly floated before her eyes and beckoned her on through the moonlight. It was the thought of her brain that assumed the shape of a phantom. Through those shadowy aisles had Gabriel wandered before her, and every stroke of the oar now brought him nearer and nearer. Then in his place at the prow of the boat rose one of the oarsmen, and as a signal sound, if others like them peradventure, sailed on those gloomy and midnight streams, blew a blast on his bugle. Wild through the dark colonnades and corridors, leafy the blast rang, breaking the seal of silence and giving tongues to the forest. Soundless above them, the banners of moss just stirred to the music. Multitudinous echoes awoke and died in the distance over the watery floor and beneath the reverberant branches. But not a voice replied, no answer came from the darkness, and when the echoes had ceased, like a sense of pain was the silence. Then Evangeline slept. But the boatmen rowed through the midnight, silent at times, then singing familiar Canadian boat songs, such as they sang of old on their own Acadian rivers. And through the night were heard the mysterious sounds of the desert, far off, indistinct, as of wave or wind in the forest, mixed with the whoop of the crane and the roar of the grim alligator. Thus, ere another noon had emerged from the shades, and before them lay in the golden sun the lakes of the Atchafalaya. Water lilies in myriads rocked on the slight undulations made by the passing oars, and resplendent in beauty, the lotus lifted her golden crown above the heads of the boatmen. Faint was the air with the odorous breath of magnolia blossoms, and with the heat of noon and numberless sylvan islands, fragrant and thickly embowered with blossoming hedges of roses, near to whose shores they glided along, invited to slumber. Soon by the fairest of these, their weary oars were suspended under the boughs of wachita willows that grew by the margin. Safely their boat was moored, and scattered about on the greensward, tired with their midnight toil, the weary travelers slumbered. Over them vast and high extended the cope of a cedar. Swinging from its great arms the trumpet flower and the grapevine hung their ladder of ropes aloft like the ladder of Jacob, on whose pendulous stairs the angels ascending, descending, were the swift hummingbirds that flitted from blossom to blossom. Such was the vision Evangeline saw as she slumbered beneath it. Filled was her heart with love, and the dawn of an opening heaven lighted her soul in sleep with the glory of regions celestial. Nearer and ever nearer, among the numberless islands, darted a light, swift boat that sped away o'er the water, urged on its course by the sinewy arms of hunters and trappers. Northward its prow was turned to the land of the bison and beaver. At the helm sat a youth with countenance thoughtful and careworn. Dark and neglected locks overshadowed his brow, and a sadness somewhat beyond his years on his face was legibly written. Gabriel was it, who, weary with waiting, unhappy and restless, sought in the western wilds oblivion of self and of sorrow. Swiftly they glided along, close under the lee of the island, but by the opposite bank, and behind a screen of palmettos, so that they saw not the boat, where it lay concealed in the willows. And undisturbed by the dash of their oars, and unseen, were the sleepers. Angel of God was there none to awaken the slumbering maiden. Swiftly they glided away, like the shade of a cloud on the prairie. After the sound of their oars on the tholes had died in the distance, as from a magic trance the sleepers awoke. And the maiden said with a sigh to the friendly priest, "O Father Felician, something says in my heart that near me Gabriel wanders. Is it a foolish dream, an idle and vague superstition? Or has an angel passed and revealed the truth to my spirit?" Then with a blush she added, "Alas for my credulous fancy! Unto ears like thine such words as these have no meaning." But made answer the reverend man, and he smiled as he answered, "Daughter, thy words are not idle, nor are they to me without meaning. Feeling is deep and still, and the word that floats on the surface is as the tossing buoy that betrays where the anchor is hidden. Therefore trust to thy heart, and to what the world calls illusions. Gabriel truly is near thee, for not far away to the southward, on the banks of the Teche, are the towns of St. Maur and St. Martin. There the long-wandering bride shall be given again to her bridegroom. There the long-absent pastor regain his flock and his sheepfold. Beautiful is the land, with its prairies and forests of fruit trees. Under the feet a garden of flowers, and the bluest of heavens bending above and resting its dome on the whales of the forest. They who dwell there have named it the Eden of Louisiana." With these words of cheer, they arose and continued their journey. Softly the evening came. The sun from the western horizon, like a magician, extended his golden wand o'er the landscape. Twinkling vapors arose, and sky and water and forest seemed all on fire at the touch, and melted and mingled together. Hanging between two skies, a cloud with edges of silver, floated the boat with its dripping oars on the motionless water. Filled was Evangeline's heart with inexpressible sweetness. Touched by the magic spell, the sacred fountains of feeling glowed with the light of love as the skies and waters around her. Then from a neighboring thicket the mockingbird, wildest of singers, swinging aloft on a willowy spray that hung o'er the water, shook from his little throat such floods of delirious music that the whole air and the woods and the waves seemed silent to listen. Plaintive at first were the tones, and sad, then soaring to madness seemed they to follow or guide the revel of the frenzied bacchantes. Single notes were then heard in sorrowful, low lamentation, till having gathered them all, he flung them abroad in derision. As when after a storm a gust of wind through the treetops shakes down the rattling rain in a crystal shower on the branches. With such a prelude as this, and hearts that throbbed with emotion, slowly they entered the Teche, where it flows through the green Opelousas. And through the amber air, above the crest of the woodland, saw the column of smoke that arose from a neighboring dwelling. Sounds of a horn they heard, and the distant lowing of cattle. This is Evangeline, part the 2nd, chapter 3. Near to the bank of the river, o'ershadowed by oaks from whose branches garlands of Spanish moss and of mystic mistletoe flaunted, such as the Druids cut down with golden hatchets at Yuletide, stood, secluded and still, the house of the herdsman. A garden girdled it round about with a belt of luxuriant blossoms, filling the air with fragrance. The house itself was of timbers hewn from the cypress tree and carefully fitted together. Large and low was the roof, and on slender columns supported, rose-wreathed, vine-encircled, a broad and spacious veranda, haunt of the hummingbird and the bee, extended around it. At each end of the house, amid the flowers of the garden, stationed the dovecots were, as love's perpetual symbol, scenes of endless wooing and endless contentions of rivals. Silence reigned o'er the place. The line of shadow and sunshine ran near the tops of the trees, but the house itself was in shadow, and from its chimney top, ascending and slowly expanding into the evening air, a thin blue column of smoke rose. In the rear of the house, from the garden gate, ran a pathway through the great groves of oak to the skirts of the limitless prairie, into whose sea of flowers the sun was slowly descending. Full in his track of light, like ships with shadowy canvas, hanging loose from their spars in a motionless calm in the tropics, stood a cluster of trees with tangled cordage of grapevines. Just where the woodlands met the flowery surf of the prairie, mounted upon his horse with Spanish saddle and stirrups, sat a herdsman, arrayed in gaiters and doublet of deerskin. Broad and brown was the face that from under the Spanish sombrero gazed on the peaceful scene with the lordly look of its master. Round about him were numberless herds of kine that were grazing quietly in the meadows and breathing the vapory freshness that uprose from the river and spread itself over the landscape. Slowly lifting the horn that hung at his side and expanding fully his broad, deep chest, he blew a blast that resounded wildly and sweet and far through the still damp air of the evening. Suddenly out of the grass, the long white horns of the cattle rose like flakes of foam on the adverse currents of ocean. Silent a moment they gazed, then, bellowing, rushed o'er the prairie, and the whole mass became a cloud, a shade in the distance. Then, as the herdsman turned to the house, through the gates of the garden saw he the forms of the priest and the maiden advancing to meet him. Suddenly, down from his horse, he sprang in amazement, and forward rushed with extended arms and exclamations of wonder. When they beheld his face, they recognized Basil, the blacksmith. Hearty his welcome was as he led his guests to the garden. There in the arbor of roses, with endless question and answer, gave they vent to their hearts and renewed their friendly embraces, laughing and weeping by turns, or sitting silent and thoughtful. Thoughtful, for Gabriel came not. And now dark doubts and misgivings stole o'er the maiden's heart, and Basil, somewhat embarrassed, broke the silence and said, "If you came by the Atchafalaya, how have you nowhere encountered my Gabriel's boat on the bayous?" Over Evangeline's face at the words of Basil a shade passed. Tears came into her eyes, and she said with a tremulous accent, "Gone? Is Gabriel gone?" And concealing her face on his shoulder, all her o'erburdened heart gave way, and she wept and lamented. Then the good Basil said, and his voice grew blithe as he said it, "Be of good cheer, my child. It is only today he departed. Foolish boy! He has left me alone with my herds and my horses." Moody and restless grown and tried and troubled, his spirit could no longer endure the calm of this quiet existence. Thinking ever of thee, uncertain and sorrowful ever silent or speaking only of thee and his troubles, he at length had become so tedious to men and to maidens, tedious even to me, that at length I bethought me and sent him unto the town of Adaias to trade for mules with the Spaniards. Thence he will follow the Indian trails to the Ozark Mountains, hunting for furs in the forests, on rivers trapping the beaver. Therefore be of good cheer, we will follow the fugitive lover. He is not far on his way, and the fates and the streams are against him. Up and away tomorrow, and through the red dew of the morning, we will follow him fast and bring him back to his prison. Then glad voices were heard, and up from the banks of the river, borne aloft on his comrades' arms, came Michael the fiddler. Long under Basil's roof had he lived like a god on Olympus, having no other care than dispensing music to mortals. Far renowned was he for his silver locks and his fiddle. Long live Michael, they cried, our brave Arcadian minstrel, as they bore him aloft in triumphal procession, and straightway Father Felician advanced with Evangeline, greeting the old man kindly and oft, and recalling the past, while Basil, enraptured, hailed with hilarious joy his old companions and gossips. Laughing loud and long, and embracing mothers and daughters, much they marveled to see the wealth of the ci-devant blacksmith, all his domains and his herds, and his patriarchal demeanor. Much they marveled to hear his tales of the soil and the climate, and of the prairies whose numberless herds were his who would take them. Each one thought in his heart that he too would go and do likewise. Thus they ascended the steps, and crossing the airy veranda, entered the hall of the house where already the supper of Basil waited his late return, and they rested and feasted together. Over the joyous feast the sudden darkness descended, all was silent without, and illumining the landscape with silver, fair rose the dewy moon and the myriad stars. But within doors, brighter than these, shone the faces of friends in the glimmering lamplight. Then from his station aloft, at the head of the table, the herdsman poured forth his heart and his wine together in endless profusion, lighting his pipe that was filled with sweet Natchitoches tobacco. Thus he spake to his guests, who listened and smiled as they listened. Welcome once more, my friends, who long have been friendless and homeless. Welcome once more to a home that is better perchance than the old one. Here no hungry winter congeals our blood like the rivers. Here no stony ground provokes the wrath of the farmer. Smoothly the plowshare runs through the soil as a keel through the water. All the year round the orange groves are in blossom, and grass grows more in a single night than a whole Canadian summer. Here, too, numberless herds run wild and unclaimed in the prairies. Here, too, lands may be had for the asking, and forests of timber, with a few blows of the axe, are hewn and framed into houses. After your houses are built and your fields are yellow with harvests, no King George of England shall drive you away from your homesteads, burning your dwellings and barns and stealing your farms and your cattle. Speaking these words, he blew a wrathful cloud from his nostrils, while his huge brown hand came thundering down on the table, so that the guests all started, and Father Felician, astounded, suddenly paused with a pinch of snuff halfway to his nostrils. But the brave Basil resumed, and his words were milder and gayer. Only beware of the fever, my friends, beware of the fever, for it is not like that of our cold Acadian climate, cured by wearing a spider hung round one's neck in a nutshell. Then there were voices heard at the door, and footsteps approaching sounded upon the stairs and the floor of the breezy veranda. It was the neighboring Creoles and small Acadian planters, who had been summoned all to the house of Basil the herdsman. Merry the meeting was of ancient comrades and neighbors. Friend clasped friend in his arms, and they who before were as strangers meeting in exile became straightway as friends to each other, drawn by the gentle bond of a common country together. But in the neighboring hall a strain of music, proceeding from the accordant strings of Michael's melodious fiddle, broke up all further speech. Away like children delighted, all things forgotten beside, they gave themselves to the maddening whirl of the dizzy dance, as it swept and swayed to the music, dreamlike with beaming eyes and the rush of fluttering garments. Meanwhile, apart, at the head of the hall, the priest and the herdsman sat, conversing together of past and present and future, while Evangeline stood like one entranced. For within her olden memories rose, and loud in the midst of the music heard she the sounds of the sea, and irrepressible sadness came o'er her heart. And unseen she stole forth into the garden. Beautiful was the night. Behind the black wall of the forest, tipping its summit with silver, arose the moon. On the river fell here and there through the branches a tremulous gleam of the moonlight, like the sweet thoughts of love on a darkened and devious spirit. Nearer and round about her, the manifold flowers of the garden poured out their souls in odors that were their prayers and confessions unto the night, as it went its way like a silent Carthusian. Fuller of fragrance than they, and as heavy with shadows and night dews, hung the heart of the maiden. The calm and the magic moonlight seemed to inundate her soul with indefinable longings. As through the garden gate and beneath the shade of the oak trees passed she along the path to the edge of the measureless prairie. Silent it lay, with a silvery haze upon it, and fireflies gleaming and floating away in mingled and infinite members. Over her head the stars, the thoughts of God in the heavens, shone on the eyes of man who had ceased to marvel and worship, save when a blazing comet was seen on the walls of that temple, as if a hand had appeared and written upon them, Upharsin. And the soul of the maiden, between the stars and the fireflies, wandered alone, and she cried, O Gabriel, O my beloved, art thou so near unto me, and yet I cannot behold thee? Art thou so near unto me, and yet thy voice does not reach me? Ah, how often thy feet have trod this path to the prairie! Ah, how often thine eyes have looked on the woodlands around me! Ah, how often beneath this oak, returning from labor, thou hast lain down to rest and to dream of me in thy slumbers. When shall these eyes behold, these arms be folded about thee? Loud and sudden near, the note of a whippoorwill sounded, like a flute in the woods. And anon, through the neighboring thickets, farther and farther away it floated and dropped into silence. Patience, whispered the oaks from oracular caverns of darkness. And from the moonlit meadow a sigh responded, tomorrow. Bright rose the sun next day, and all the flowers of the garden bathed his shining feet with their tears, and anointed his tresses with the delicious balm that they bore in their vases of crystal. Farewell, said the priest as he stood at the shadowy threshold. See that you bring us the prodigal son from his fasting and famine, and to the foolish virgin who slept when the bridegroom was coming. Farewell, answered the maiden, and smiling with Basil descended down to the river's brink, where the boatmen already were waiting, thus beginning their journey with morning and sunshine and gladness. Swiftly they followed the flight of him who was speeding before them, blown by the blast of fate like a dead leaf over the desert. Not that day, nor the next, nor yet the day that succeeded, found they trace of his course in lake or forest or river, nor after many days had they found him. But vague and uncertain rumors alone were their guides through a wild and desolate country, till at the little inn of the Spanish town of Adeus, weary and worn, they alighted and learned from the garrulous landlord that on the day before, with horses and guides and companions, Gabriel left the village and took the road of the prairies. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Bruce Andrews, wishing you a pleasant day and the time to enjoy it to the fullest. Until next time, good day.